Thank you very, very much. As you might have gathered from the generous introduction, the insight and comparative comments on conflict situations and transitions to peace situations that will follow are things that emerge in me throughout my participation in different crossroads of the Israel-Palestine situation. In 1991, Madrid Peace Conference, where I was privileged to form part of the Israeli delegation, and then the multilateral forum on refugees in the Middle East, where I represented Israel in 1993, and then, of course, the more intensive stay with President Clinton and Chairman Arafat in Camp David in an attempt to reach a settlement, and through the generosity of the President of Colombia, Mr. Juan Manuel Santos, I was drawn into the Colombian conflict and served practically with the President in the resolution of the conflict with the guerrilla, which ended with a peace agreement happily, which is not the case always, as the Palestinian-Israeli situation can show. Now, I think it is not a statement that you might differ from if I say that diplomatic solutions are not today very common in conflict throughout the world. If you look at the border between NATO and Russia, in the wake of Putin's revisionism, you see a military build-up unprecedented since the end of the Cold War, and nobody can see that the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, Arab-Israeli situation will solve itself anytime soon. And in the Far East, a professor in Harvard, the Kennedy School, coined the expression of Thucydides' trap, saying that China and the United States might not be able to escape the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap, as you know, Thucydides was a historian of about 2,500 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, that wrote about the Peloponnesian War. And the thesis essentially is that when a rising power challenges an established power, war becomes inevitable. So if China, the rising power, challenges the established power, that is the United States, according to this professor Graham Allison, the war might happen. If it is or not inevitable, it's another question. In fact, in 1907, a British official of the Foreign Office by the name of Crowe wrote the Crowe Memorandum, 1907, predicting that the rise of Germany challenging the established naval power of Britain will end in war, which it did in 1914. You can see a discussion of the Crowe Memorandum in Henry Kissinger's book on China. Now, history suggests that diplomacy produces results only when backed by overwhelming power, or when parties get trapped in painful deadlocks. Such a deadlock happened in 1973, for example, in the Israel-Egyptian situation, in the Israeli-Egyptian war. The Yom Kippur War, if it did not end in a tie, it would have been extremely difficult for Henry Kissinger to launch an Israeli-Egyptian peace process, which he did. And the Oslo Accords might not have happened if it were not for the 1991 Gulf War and the Palestinian Intifada. Or if you look at the Balkans, for example, more than the diplomatic vocation of Europe, it was NATO's military intervention that created the conditions for the end of ethnic cleansing in the old Yugoslavia. Kosovo's drive for independence could not have materialized before Serbia was militarily humbled. So peace, in my view, is hardly ever the naive attainment of a non-coercive situation. Treating power and diplomacy as distinct and separate never convince the negotiators. You cannot run a peace process, whether it is in Colombia, in the Middle East, or anywhere else, if there is no power behind it. America's only successful attempts at peacemaking in the Middle East involved coercive diplomacy. Kissinger used it to lead Israel to a groundbreaking interim settlement with Egypt and Syria following the 1973 war. President Jimmy Carter used coercive diplomacy to reach an Israeli-Egyptian peace. George Bush, father, and James Baker both excelled in the use of American power for diplomatic purposes. They turned their extraordinary capacity of coalition building in the first Gulf War into the platform, into the leverage upon which they built the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991 on the Middle East. So history also suggests that states were always invariably born amid dramas of blood and self-sacrifice. The peaceful split of Norway and Sweden and the amicable divorce of the Czech and Slovak republics have never been the norm. Not an irrelevant message, I must say, to the extravagant drive for independence of some non-oppressed nations in Europe, Catalans, Corsicans, and others. President Abbas of Palestine has a strategy of getting a Palestinian state through the goodwill of the international community. I think that this is a flawed drive, sadly. Just as flawed was the hope of Irish nationalists, for example, in 1919, to get statehood on a silver platter from the Versailles Peace Conference. They would have it 2 years later, only after making life unbearable for the British occupier. This is not to say, however, that blood and sacrifice are sufficient. Ask, if not, the Kurds, the Chechens, the Tibetans, and you name them. There are many others. Self-determination is not a God-given right unless God's name is Woodrow Wilson. Rather, it is an objective that nations achieve through an intelligent use of power and diplomacy, and the capacity to exploit historical opportunities when they emerge. The Palestinians missed that in many vital crossroads, since at least the Peel Commission recommendations of 1937. The Kurds, a nation of 30 million people, are caught in an impossible strategic trap that always end up stifling their drive for independence, their legitimate aspiration for statehood. Yazid Sayed is a Palestinian professor in Cambridge University, not exactly an ardent Zionist, blamed Arafat's second intifada for condemning the Palestinians to the same tragic fate of the Kurds. He has written a brilliant article, Arafat, Anatomy of a Revolt. Or listen to Nabil Amr, a minister of Arafat's cabinet, who spelled out his criticism in an article in Hayat al-Jadida, a mouthpiece of the Palestinian Authority, 2 years into the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and after Arafat had rejected Clinton's peace parameters. And I quote, this is a Palestinian minister: "Didn't we destroy the pictures of President Clinton, who so boldly presented us with proposals for a Palestinian state with border modifications? We are not being honest, for today, after 2 years of bloodshed, we ask exactly that which we then rejected. How many times did we agree to compromises, which we later rejected in order to miss them later on? And we were never willing to draw the lessons from our behavior. And then, when the solution was no longer available, we traveled the world in order to plead with the international community for what we had just rejected. But then we learned the hard way that in the span of time between our rejection and our acceptance, the world has changed and left us behind. We clearly failed to rise up to the challenge of history. End of quote. Arguably, the coercive brand of diplomacy, as it was applied in the Yom Kippur War or in Bosnia, belongs to the conditions of the old battlefield. The era of glorious victories is over. There are no more glorious victories anywhere in the planet. I think that even before these days, Vietnam was not a glorious victory, and it happened in the 1960s. The linear Clausewitzian convention, Clausewitz, of military action facilitating a political solution is no longer relevant to the asymmetric wars of today. Take an example from America's shock and awe war in Iraq. This is a campaign that ended in victory with the toppling of Saddam Hussein, but opened the gates of hell for the forces of occupation for more than a decade, and left them without a valid interlocutor to make peace with. In such cases, power needs to be tempered by reasonable compromises. Negotiating with the Taliban in Afghanistan and with the FARC guerrilla in Colombia makes more sense than fighting unwinnable wars where even a military deadlock is no longer conducive to negotiations. Victory in internal conflicts, not between states, because we no longer have wars between states. The industrial wars of the past are no longer there. God forbid, they might still happen, but that is a stage that we have superseded, okay? Now, in internal conflict, you can win the war only if you break all the rules of war, show no mercy for the defeated, and defy the sensibilities of the international community. Syria is today the case in point. You turn a blind eye to what is going on, and the war continues and continues and goes on, and there is no international institution that will call either the Syrians or Vladimir Putin to order. Long years of mediation and endless peace proposals in the Sri Lanka conflict failed to end the war. Peace, quotation marks, came about with the total and unconditional defeat of the Tamils. In democratic societies, however, governments can be coaxed into assuming the inevitability of compromise thanks to the pressure from below. Civil society's mobilization for bridging the psychological gap between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland helped pave the way to peace. And Israel's withdrawal in May 2000 from Lebanon after 18 years of useless military occupation was made in great part under the immense impact that the Four Mothers movement had on the government. Colombia's peace has recently highlighted the controversial relationship between peace and justice. The Nuremberg trials provide an ideal model for post-conflict justice. But in cases where no side has been defeated, a trade-off between reconciliation and accountability may well be inescapable. The fundamentalist notion of the ICC, of the International Criminal Court, that in the transition from war to peace, the rule of law replaces politics, is, I'm afraid, utterly unrealistic. I'm afraid that this is a lesson for the Palestinian conflict as well. Palestine is a difficult case indeed. It is the total and absolute nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has made it into such a desperately protracted dispute. It is not just a collision over territory or a banal border dispute. It is a clash of rights and memory, an attempt to break the very genetic code of the Arab-Israeli conflict and perhaps of the entire Jewish-Muslim dispute. Millenarian certificates of ownership clash with the longing for the fig tree and the terrace farming. This longing for the same landscapes, the mutually exclusive claims on religious sites and symbols, and the ethos of dispossession made their narratives practically irreconcilable. The insolubility of the Palestinian plight lies in that the fig tree is not a metaphor. It is meant literally. The vital ethos of Palestinian nationalism has never been the drive for statehood. Rather, it is the yearning of return to the village and the very trees left behind. And this, the unachievable dream of return, is what made all peace proposals so desperately non-attractive to the Palestinian leadership. A mini Palestinian state sandwiched between two neighbors, Israel and Jordan, both deeply suspicious of its future evolution, cannot satisfy the fundamental requirements of the Palestinian constituent ethos of return. There is nothing more outlandish than to ask Hamas to turn the Gaza Strip into a Palestinian Singapore. This has never been the driving ethos of Palestinian nationalism, let alone of its Islamic branch. Nor is the two-state idea natural to the Palestinian movement. Its political father and its major source of legitimacy, Yasser Arafat, is no longer there to give the necessary cohesion to a movement that has lost its sense of purpose, that is fragmented, and whose political spinal cord, Fatah, the party that led the shift to the idea of partition, is broken, practically non-existent. A Palestinian state that does not meet the yearning of return is bound to be illegitimate in the eyes of the Palestinians themselves. Now, the pernicious effects of Israeli occupation on the Palestinians have, of course, much to account for. But the current institutional disarray in Palestine cannot be exclusively blamed on the occupier. State building was never the main motive of a movement split between pan-Islamist dreamers of a borderless Arab nation and secular nationalists that 4 times in their history rejected offers of a Palestinian state. With a colossal tragedy as its constituent ethos, is a tragedy of cosmic dimensions. Not for a moment do I doubt it. It mainly represented the vindication of rights denied and the dreams of restitution of a disinherited nation. An Israeli leader has yet to emerge, because I think that it is the core problem of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, the question of the narrative of return. Therefore, I think that an Israeli leader has yet to emerge to take responsibility for the Palestinian tragedy of dispossession and exile. Moral reparation, no less than the material one, is vital for the beginning of a true process of reconciliation between these two nations. There is, I must admit, an unexpected irony in the fact that the Israeli Jews, who owe their existence as a nation to their extraordinary memory of past history, should now rely on the Palestinians forgetting theirs. Third-party involvement in peacemaking can always help, and it is sometimes a vital necessity. But this requires that the guarantor respects his commitments with the peacemakers. A defining moment in Israel's loss of trust in the international community's mediating role happened in 1967. UN Secretary General U Thant and the world powers paved the way to war by ignoring their own guarantees for the freedom of navigation in the strategic straits of Tiran. Menachem Begin later ridiculed the pretensions of international peace brokers. I have no problems with guarantees, he said, but what I need are guarantees to guarantee the guarantees. Or take the case of the Ukraine. In the 1994 Budapest Protocol, she agreed to waive her nuclear capabilities in exchange for international guarantees to her territorial integrity. Possibly Crimea might have still be Ukrainian, might have still belonged to the Ukraine, and Putin might have already ceased his harassment of eastern Ukraine if Kiev would have kept her nuclear arsenal. So what is the motive for nations to accept the involvement of the international community? Peacemakers are frequently called, this is internal affairs, they are frequently called to excel in the art of political betrayal. I gave a seminar for graduate students at Columbia University, and I praised such leaders. And one of the students, she was a Colombian girl, said, President Santos has committed the betrayal. He didn't say that he's going to make such concessions to the guerrilla. But then what you see from here, you don't see from there. Sharon in Israel built the settlements in Gaza. Practically all the settlements. And he was a nationalistic demagogue when he was in opposition. When he came to power, he dismantled all the settlements in Gaza because the statesman perspective is different than the opposition agitator, or the populist agitator. So you need to betray sometimes the electorate. In politics, it is necessary either to betray one's country or to betray the electorate. I prefer to betray the electorate. Explain de Gaulle. This is what de Gaulle said when he gave up Algeria. King Abdullah I of Jordan, Anwar Sadat, and Yitzhak Rabin, the three of them were assassinated and paid with their lives for such a benign betrayal, such a noble betrayal of the electorate. Nor could ever, as I said, Ariel Sharon perform the single most important move against Israel's settlements obsession, the dismantling of the entire Israeli colonial presence in Gaza without betraying his electorate, and indeed his own political biography. What Sharon did is all about putting Machiavelli on his head. The author of The Prince praised leaders who did not keep their word to respect peace agreements. That was okay with Machiavelli. Making peace while risking the grip on power was to Machiavelli, so it seems, an exercise in unpardonable political naivete. And therefore these people normally are not popular. There is hardly anywhere in the world where the peacemaker is popular. Santos in Colombia is ending his second term in office, I think with 20% approval rate, which is quite high in such conditions. Others get assassinated. Making war is what makes great leaders. Peacemakers are never seen as great leaders, unless there is an obscure committee in Norway, Oslo, that decides to give them the Nobel Peace Prize. Foreign policy, particularly in a conflict environment, requires solid domestic foundations. But the utterly dysfunctional Israeli political system is more an obstacle than a vehicle for conflict resolution. In Prime Minister Netanyahu's politics of populist mobilization, the quest for peace is ignored for the same reason that I said before. Driving to peace is losing power in conflict situations. It's almost mathematical. And he speaks always about existential threats from outside, etc. War unites nations, as also do foreign enemies. And sometimes, as Netanyahu's handbook of political survival shows, internal ones as well. It is the search for peace that divides nations. Moreover, the leader in quest for peace will too often have not only a split nation, but also a divided polity, threatening to derail his peace enterprise. The real existential threat to Israel, contrary to what Netanyahu says, and he prefers to ignore it, is internal. An ethno-religious regime that edges towards a South African reality is the end of Israel as it was conceived by the founding fathers. Now, domestic concerns are not exclusive to democracies. Paraphrasing Sigmund Freud, one might say that the Israeli-Syrian peace negotiation at the start of the millennium collapsed for what Freud called the narcissism of minor differences. In the breakdown into pieces of the old Yugoslavia, it was narcissism of the ethnic brand that played a central role. But of course, the few square meters, you won't believe it. We're talking about 10 meters square, 20 meters square. That was what prevented the peace agreement between Israel and Syria when we were in government. This is what we are talking about. So imagine to what degrees, to what levels of lunacy can leaders get for national pride or for the domestic consequences of what can be seen as giving in to the enemy. One of the conditions, if you take, for example, the Iranian nuclear deal with the West, according to the Iranians, and indeed that was the purpose of the agreement, the agreement dealt only with the question of the nuclear installations. It was about freezing the nuclear project, and the Iranians are right to argue that the agreement does not affect other areas of dispute with the United States. In 2003, in the West, we like to say that the Iranians are irrational, but it is not true. Being radical does not mean that you are irrational. You can be radical and rational. It's not a contradiction in terms. In 2003, when the Americans have taken over Afghanistan and have taken over Iraq, the Iranians understood that they are next on the line. And therefore they came to the United States with one of the most generous peace proposals. They were ready to put an end to their nuclear project. They were ready to negotiate the Israeli-Palestinian situation, not to interfere in the internal affairs of any other country in the region, because they were very rational. They thought they are going to be attacked next. Dick Cheney, the vice president, gave the answer. We do not negotiate with evil, he said. Okay, the problem is that now you negotiate with evil, but only on one issue, because they are stronger. You negotiate only on the nuclear issue. They didn't promise to stop terrorism, to finance terrorism, to support Hezbollah, to support Hamas. It's only this, and that was a mistake of the then American administration. But one need also to see, since the preoccupation of leaders, particularly in a revolution like the Islamic Revolution, is on the internal stability, for the Iranian regime, an end to the slogan of death to America after Friday prayer is either the end of the regime or its transformation into something else. Death to America, having America and Israel as the big Satan and the small Satan or the little Satan is part of the identity of the revolution. If you end this, then it's a different stuff. It's something else. It's not the revolution as it was conceived. So economic considerations are sometimes important. They are a platform upon which governments can rise, can have their own revolutions, policy, etc. But they are secondary to to nationalism. Nationalism and the drive to maintain, to safeguard the revolution is more important than economic considerations. And this is true even in democracies. You might, I don't know if you came across the booklet written by a famous economist in the 1920s, John Maynard Keynes. There is a revival today in this country. You are now have the program of new infrastructures. This is a Keynesian idea. Keynes wrote a booklet in 1919 which he gave to the leaders of Europe that were negotiating the end of the Versailles peace settlement. And in the booklet, the title of the book was The Economic Consequences of Peace. He tried to convince them not to punish Germany, but to try and integrate Germany. Nationalism, patriotism is a very bad advisor for an era of peace. Try to integrate Germany. No, they punished Germany, and they would integrate Germany after yet another world war. So think what millions of citizens, how millions of citizens are affected by wrong decisions of government. The current Middle East mayhem is due, partly at least, to America's policies. First we had George W. Bush's, I think that somebody in his administration spoke about constructive instability. That is, you create instability in order to construct something new. Eventually, we were left only with the instability side. They didn't reach, the constructive phase. And then we had Obama's timid vacillation between withdrawal and engagement. But I don't think that it would be fair to say that the crisis in the lands of Islam it has to do only with America's policy. It is very easy to claim that in anti-American areas of the Middle East. It is the crisis of the whole civilization. That this crisis leads to the embrace of religious extremism that leads to death and destruction only proves the intensity of the crisis experienced by Islam in the modern era. Therefore, I think that engaging political Islam needs to be a central component in a new reform and peace strategy in the Middle East. And when I say political Islam, I mean Hamas as well. The challenge is not how to destroy Islamic movements, but how to turn them away from revolutionary politics by allowing them a legitimate political space. President Assisi in Egypt works on the basis of a zero-sum game. It is either me or them. And I think that building a democracy for a devout people like the Egyptian, where 90% define themselves as religious, requires to understand that there is also a political option for Islamist parties. Now, political Islam is one thing, global jihadism is another. Eradicating the mother of all jihadists, ISIS, was of course a noble mission. Yet, strategic Unfortunately, I still find it extremely difficult to understand why America is obsessed with ISIS, and it continues to be obsessed to this very day. I might be totally wrong, but I frankly don't understand what is the obsession with ISIS. We are talking about several thousand, now perhaps only several hundred, guys on Toyotas that create problems precisely where there is no state, in no man's land. The real edges of ISIS are functioning nation states. Only where you do not have a functioning nation state, you have ISIS. And if you don't have ISIS, and the regional socio-political ecosystem does not change, you will have, for many years to come, Sunni warlords as part of the landscape. That's the problem of the Arab state. The Arab state is melting down. So if you fight ISIS, another group, maybe less flamboyant, will emerge. What's the point? And this administration in the United States is against the concept of nation building. But nation building is the real answer. Only state building and nation building will stop ISIS. Why do we have ISIS in Syria? Because there is no state. Why ISIS in Iraq? Because there is no state. Why ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula? Because the Egyptians do not control the Sinai Peninsula. Why we don't have ISIS in Iran? Because it is a state. Why not in Israel? Because it is a state. Why not in Turkey? Because it is a nation state. That's the answer, not fighting an invisible enemy practically. But anyway, this is the policy, and I truly hope it will succeed. But it won't succeed if it is not accompanied by a project that strengthens the concept of the nation state. Now, Iran is. We have time. How much? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. A few words about Iran, because she is portrayed normally as the main rising power, the one that stabilizes the region. I think that Iran needs an approach which is slightly more nuanced. Iran is incapable of projecting conventional military power beyond her borders. In fact, her nuclear program was intended to compensate for her conventional military weakness in a neighborhood where Iran has more enemies than friends. That's the reason that from the very beginning, the attempt of Barack Obama to reach with the Russians zero nuclear armaments as an objective, it is a very noble objective, couldn't take off because of the conventional weakness of the Russians. They know that if what makes, in the 1920s, Lenin, the father of the Russian Revolution, was asked, what is communism? His answer was, communism is the Soviets and electricity. If you ask today in Russia, what is Putinism? Putinism is gas and nuclear weapons. If you don't have nuclear weapons, Russia is like Nigeria. It's an impoverished nation with a very, very serious problem, demographic problem, a vast geography, with an incredible history, incredible culture, but hollow. There's nothing. What makes them a superpower is gas and not electricity, nuclear power. So Iran is weak conventionally. And in Syria, they have invested a lot in Syria to end up finding out that the real hegemon in Syria is not them, but Putin. Russia is the real hegemon. I think that Netanyahu has harnessed Trump to the wrong battle of doing away with Iran's nuclear deal. The right battle is in the Syria-Lebanon arch with Hezbollah's formidable ballistic capabilities and Iran's commitment to turn this into a hot front. Israel cannot rely on Putin willing to keep at bay her enemies in the Syria and Lebanon front. It is the withdrawal of the United States from the strategic equation in Syria that leaves Israel so dangerously exposed. Last but not necessarily least, and this is my last remark on, is an Iranian fallacy related to the lessons of history. As was the case of the Soviet Union, that collapsed under the burden of an imperial overstretch and her failure to manage domestic challenges, Iran's unsustainable grand strategy and the erosion of the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic at home may build up into an existential threat for the revolution. Normally in history, if you look at the major revolutions, they thought that the best way to protect the revolution is by exporting it. This is what the French Revolution did, this is what the Russian Revolution did. But while exporting it, there is the risk of imperial overstretch. And this is what is happening with the Iranians. While the future of the revolution lies at home, just as it happened with the French Revolution and just as it happened with the Soviet Revolution. It collapsed from within. It melted down from within and not because of some war that was launched against them. I have this strange thesis, I don't know how solid it is, that 3 generations is a long time for any revolutionary utopia. The Soviet Revolution collapsed in the 3rd generation. I can think of a different kind of revolution, but yes, in a movement. I don't know if you came across the kibbutz movement in Israel. It resisted for 3 generations. It was one of the most fascinating utopias you can think of. Communism with freedom, communism with liberty. And it collapsed, it changed into something else in the 3rd generation. And if I take the Iranian case, the 3rd generation in the digital age moves faster. And I think that today, with about half of Iran's population under the age of 30, and youth unemployment at around 25%, it should come as no surprise that some recent demonstrators chanted, "Give up on Syria, think of us." In the 1980s, in the face of a brutal assault by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Iranians rallied behind the regime to ensure their country's survival. Would they submit to similar hardships today in the name of maintaining outposts in Syria and Yemen, or a land corridor to the Mediterranean? Iran can be a spoiler in the Middle East, but not a hegemon. Just as Russia, that is an impoverished nation, its GDP is smaller than Brazil's and South Korea. That's the GDP of Russia, with all the rhetoric of Putin. So he can be a spoiler, but not a hegemon. To argue otherwise, as Israeli and Arab leaders are wont to do, makes more likely a conflict that all parties have a fundamental interest in avoiding. Nobody wants a war with Iran, nobody wants a war with Hezbollah, for it can only result in a horrific death toll, massive destruction, and further chaos in a region that is already perhaps the most dysfunctional region of the planet, the Middle East. Thank you.